Hitler's secret hideout. Deep in the heart of the Bavarian Alps, hidden among towering mountain peaks and endless forests, there existed a place that held the darkest secrets of the 20th century. This was not just a building or a simple retreat. This was a fortress of evil, a sanctuary where one of history's most terrible leaders planned the deaths of millions, made decisions that changed the world forever, and eventually watched his empire crumble into dust and ashes. This place was called the Breakout, and it stood as Adolf Hitler's secret hideout, his private kingdom where he escaped from the eyes of the world while simultaneously controlling it with an iron fist. Behind the beautiful mountain scenery and peaceful alpine views, unimaginable horrors were conceived, strategies of war were drawn, and the fate of entire nations was decided over afternoon tea and casual conversations. The story of this hideout is not just about walls and rooms, but about power, madness, secrecy, and the chilling reality of how evil can hide in the most beautiful places. This is the entire story of Hitler's secret hideout, a journey into the dark heart of Nazi Germany, and a revelation of secrets that were buried in mountain shadows for generations. The tale begins not with grand plans or military strategy, but with a young man's simple love for mountains and solitude. Long before Adolf Hitler became the dictator who would plunge the world into its deadliest war, he was a struggling artist and wandering soul who found peace in the German countryside. In the early 1920s, after his failed attempt to overthrow the German government in Munich, Hitler was sent to prison where he wrote his infamous book that outlined his twisted vision for Germany's future. Upon his release, he was a changed man, more determined and more dangerous than ever before. During this period of rebuilding his political movement, Hitler discovered a small mountain village called Berchtesgaden, located in the southeastern corner of Bavaria, right at the border with Austria. The area was breathtakingly beautiful, with snow-capped mountains, green valleys, crystal-clear lakes, and air so pure it seemed to wash away all the troubles of the industrial world below. Hitler fell in love with this region immediately, seeing in it something that spoke to his soul, perhaps reminding him of his Austrian childhood, or perhaps offering him the sense of superiority he felt when standing above the world on a mountaintop. In 1928, Hitler rented a small cottage on the Obersalzberg mountain, a modest dwelling that belonged to a local widow. This simple house, called Haus Wachenfeld, became his refuge from the intense political battles he was fighting in Berlin and Munich. Here, surrounded by nature's magnificence, Hitler could think, plan, and dream about the Germany he wanted to create. The cottage was nothing special at first, just a typical alpine house with wooden walls, a small garden, and basic furniture. But for Hitler, it represented freedom and possibility. He would spend weeks at a time in this mountain retreat, writing, meeting with close associates, and slowly building the network that would eventually bring him to power. His half-sister Angela came to manage the household, bringing with her daughter Julie, who would later become a tragic figure in Hitler's personal life. The peaceful mountain setting seemed completely disconnected from the violence and hatred that Hitler was spreading through his political speeches in the cities below, creating a strange and disturbing contrast between the beauty of nature and the ugliness of his ideology. As Hitler's political power grew through the late 1920s and early 1930s, so did his ambitions for his mountain retreat. The small cottage that had once satisfied him now seemed inadequate for a man who saw himself as Germany's future leader. When the Nazi Party began winning more seats in the German parliament and money started flowing into party coffers from wealthy industrialists and supporters, Hitler decided to transform his modest mountain house into something far grander. In 1933, when he became Chancellor of Germany, the transformation began in earnest. Hitler purchased the property outright and immediately commissioned architects to expand it dramatically. The simple cottage would be swallowed up by a massive expansion that would turn it into a sprawling complex worthy of a dictator. The new building, which Hitler named the Breakout, would feature enormous windows offering panoramic views of the surrounding mountains, a great hall for receiving important guests, numerous bedrooms for staff and visitors, modern amenities that were luxurious for the time, and most importantly, the infrastructure needed to function as an alternate seat of government when Hitler chose to rule from the mountains rather than Berlin. The construction of the Berghof was an enormous undertaking that transformed the entire Obersalzberg area. Hitler's architect, Alois de Gano, working under Hitler's direct supervision, created a building that reflected both Hitler's personal taste and his sense of his own importance. The most striking feature of the new Berghof was a massive window in the Great Hall, reportedly the largest single pane of glass in the world at that time, which could be lowered into the floor at the push of a button, effectively removing the barrier between the interior of the house and the spectacular mountain view beyond. This window became famous in photographs and films, showing Hitler standing before the Alps as if he commanded not just Germany but nature itself. The Great Hall was decorated with expensive furnishings, including a massive marble fireplace, valuable paintings, and a huge globe that Hitler reportedly enjoyed spinning while discussing his plans for world domination with his generals and advisors. The building also included Hitler's private study, numerous guest rooms, quarters for his personal staff, and a bowling alley in the basement because Hitler enjoyed the sport despite being not particularly skilled at it. But the Berghof was just the beginning of what would become a vast secret complex spreading across the Obersalzberg mountain. As Hitler's power solidified and World War II approached, the entire area was transformed into a heavily fortified zone that served as the second capital of Nazi Germany. Other Nazi leaders were encouraged, or rather required, to build their own residences nearby so they would always be close to Hitler when he was in residence. Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command and head of the Luftwaffe, built a lavish estate he called Herrenhall nearby. Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful secretary and administrator, constructed his own house and effectively became the master of the entire Berghof complex, controlling access to Hitler and managing the enormous construction projects that would turn the mountain into a fortress. Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect who would later become Minister of Armaments, also built a residence in the area and spent countless hours at the Berghof discussing building plans for the new Germany Hitler envisioned after victory in the war. The transformation of Obersalzberg into Hitler's secret mountain headquarters required removing the people who had lived there for generations. Local families who had farmed the land and run small hotels and guest houses for tourists were systematically evicted from their properties, often receiving minimal compensation and having no choice but to comply with the orders that came backed by the full power of the Nazi state. By the mid-1930s, the entire mountain had been cleared of its original inhabitants and turned into a restricted security zone. Massive fences were erected around the perimeter, guard posts were established at every access point, and only people with special passes approved by Hitler's security service could enter. The Schutzstaffel, the notorious SS organization, took control of security for the entire area, establishing barracks for guards, checkpoints along all roads, and a system of surveillance that made the Berghof complex one of the most secure locations in all of Germany. The free and open mountain area that had attracted Hitler with its peaceful beauty had been transformed into an exclusive, heavily guarded compound that ordinary Germans could never visit and could barely even see from a distance. The scale of construction on the Obersalzberg during the 1930s was staggering and demonstrated both the unlimited resources at Hitler's disposal and his obsession with this mountain retreat. Thousands of workers were brought in to build not just houses but an entire infrastructure to support Hitler's mountain headquarters. New roads were carved into the mountainside to provide access for the increasing number of officials, diplomats, and military leaders who needed to visit Hitler when he was in residence. A complex system of bunkers and tunnels was excavated deep into the mountain to provide protection in case of air attack, though in the early years of Nazi rule such an attack seemed unlikely since Germany was not yet at war, and Hitler was still presenting himself to the world as a reasonable leader who only wanted to restore Germany's dignity after the humiliations of World War I. Telephone lines, electrical systems, water supplies, and all the other necessities of modern life were installed throughout the complex, often at enormous expense and requiring impressive feats of engineering given the challenging mountain terrain. One of the most remarkable and least known aspects of the Berghof complex was the extensive bunker system that was constructed beneath the mountain. As war approached and then became reality, Hitler and his planners became increasingly concerned about the possibility of Allied bombing attacks on the Berghof. In response, they ordered the construction of an elaborate underground facility that would allow Hitler and his staff to survive even a sustained aerial bombardment. The bunkers were not simple bomb shelters, but rather an underground complex that included living quarters, offices, communications equipment, storage for food and supplies, and even recreational facilities. The main bunker system was connected to the Berghof by a tunnel so that Hitler could move between his residence and the protected underground area without ever stepping outside. Additional tunnels connected various buildings in the complex, creating a hidden underground world beneath the scenic mountain landscape. The construction of these bunkers required moving thousands of tons of rock and earth, pouring massive amounts of concrete, and installing sophisticated ventilation systems to make the underground spaces habitable for extended periods. Life at the Berghof when Hitler was in residence followed strange and rigid routines that reflected Hitler's personal habits and preferences. The dictator was known to be a late riser, often not emerging from his private quarters until late morning or even early afternoon. He would then have a light breakfast, perhaps take a short walk in the immediate grounds of the house if the weather was pleasant, and begin receiving reports and visitors. Hitler's daily routine at the Berghof was far less structured than it was in Berlin, which was both relaxing for him and frustrating for the military commanders and government officials who needed decisions on important matters but found Hitler difficult to pin down for serious discussions. The dictator preferred to spend his afternoons watching movies, a passion of his, or having long, rambling conversations about art, architecture, history, and his plans for Germany's future. He would hold forth on his favorite topics for hours while his audience, which included both important Nazi officials and members of his personal household staff, was required to sit and listen attentively no matter how many times they had heard the same stories and opinions before. The evenings at the Berghof were particularly strange affairs that revealed much about Hitler's personality and the bizarre court that surrounded him. Dinner was served late, often not beginning until 9 or 10 in the evening, and would stretch on for hours. Hitler was a vegetarian, a fact he often mentioned as evidence of his sensitivity and higher moral development compared to meat eaters, and the meals served at his table reflected his dietary preferences, though meat was available for guests who wanted it. After dinner, Hitler would lead his guests into the great hall where they would sit around the enormous fireplace or stand by the famous picture window and continue conversations that could last until 3 or 4 in the morning. These late-night gatherings were not optional for those who were present at the Berghof. Hitler expected his inner circle to remain with him until he finally decided to retire for the night, which meant that exhausted generals, administrators, and household staff had to stay awake and appear interested in whatever topic Hitler chose to discuss, even if it meant getting only a few hours of sleep before the next day's responsibilities began. Eva Braun played a central but carefully hidden role in the life of the Berghof that most Germans and even many Nazi officials knew nothing about for years. Hitler had met Eva, a young woman who worked in the photography studio of Hitler's personal photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, in the late 1920s, and by the early 1930s she had become his mistress. However, Hitler was obsessed with maintaining his public image as a man married only to Germany, dedicated entirely to his nation, with no personal attachments that might diminish his appeal to German women who saw him as an idealized figure. Therefore, Eva's existence was kept secret from the German public, and her role at the Berghof was carefully managed to avoid giving the impression that she was Hitler's romantic partner. When foreign dignitaries or journalists visited, Eva would often be sent away or instructed to pretend she was merely a member of the household staff or a guest visiting someone else. However, When Hitler was at the Berghof with only his inner circle present, Eva functioned as the hostess of the house, organizing entertainment, ensuring guests were comfortable, and spending time with Hitler in a more relaxed domestic setting than he experienced anywhere else. Eva Braun's life at the Berghof was one of luxury mixed with frustration and isolation. She had beautiful rooms in the house, access to the finest clothes and jewelry, and the ability to pursue her hobbies of photography and filmmaking, which she did extensively, creating a remarkable visual record of life at Hitler's mountain retreat. However, she was also essentially a prisoner of the Berghof complex, unable to leave without permission, forbidden from appearing in public with Hitler, and forced to watch as the man she loved spent far more time discussing military strategy and political ideology than paying attention to her. Eva attempted suicide at least twice during her relationship with Hitler, actions that reflected her deep unhappiness with a situation in which she had given up any chance at a normal life, but received little in return except material comfort and the secret knowledge that she was the companion of Germany's most powerful man. Despite these difficulties, Eva remained loyal to Hitler until the very end, choosing to die with him in his Berlin bunker in 1945 rather than escape and save her own life. The Berghof served as much more than just Hitler's personal retreat and private residence. Throughout the 1930s and into the war years, it functioned as an alternate seat of government where major decisions affecting Germany and eventually the entire world were made. Hitler often preferred to work from the Berghof rather than Berlin, finding the mountain setting more conducive to his thinking and planning. This meant that military commanders, government ministers, foreign diplomats, and other important figures had to make the journey to Bavaria if they wanted to meet with Hitler, turning the remote mountain location into a center of power that rivaled the capital city itself. Some of the most significant decisions of the Nazi era were made at the Berghof during afternoon walks in the garden or evening conversations in the Great Hall. Hitler met with Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg at the Berghof in February 1938 and essentially bullied him into accepting terms that would lead to Germany's annexation of Austria the following month. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain visited the Berghof in September 1938 during the crisis over Czechoslovakia, a meeting that was part of the failed appeasement policy that would ultimately prove disastrous. The Berghof also served as a stage for Nazi propaganda, though in a carefully controlled way that revealed the contradictions in how Hitler wanted to present himself to the German people. On one hand, Hitler wanted Germans to see him as a man of the people who lived simply and dedicated himself entirely to the nation's welfare. Photographs and films showing Hitler at the Berghof were released to the public, presenting an image of the leader relaxing in his modest mountain home, taking walks in nature, playing with his German shepherd dogs, and meeting with ordinary German children who were brought to the Berghof for carefully staged encounters. These propaganda materials were designed to make Hitler seem approachable and human, countering the reality of his growing dictatorial power. On the other hand, Hitler also wanted to be seen as a world leader of importance and sophistication, which required presenting the Berghof as a grand residence worthy of Germany's greatness. When foreign visitors came, they were meant to be impressed by the scale and luxury of the complex, the dramatic views, and the sense that they were visiting the mountain kingdom of a powerful ruler. The beginning of World War II in September 1939 changed the character of the Berghof from a peaceful retreat where Hitler spent much of his time to a military command center where the war was planned and directed. As German forces invaded Poland and then turned west to attack France, the Low Countries, and eventually the Soviet Union, Hitler spent increasing amounts of time at various military headquarters closer to the front lines. However, he continued to return to the Berghof regularly, and the complex became an important center for military planning and conferences with his top generals. The Great Hall where Hitler had once held forth on art and architecture now echoed with discussions of military strategy, invasion plans, and reports from the various fronts where German forces were fighting. Maps covered the walls and tables, showing the extent of German conquests and the locations of military units. Officers arrived at all hours bringing dispatches from the battlefields, and the peaceful mountain retreat took on the atmosphere of a wartime command post. Despite the war, life at the Berghof retained some of its earlier character, particularly when Hitler took breaks from military matters to relax in his favorite setting. He still watched movies in the evening, still held long dinners with rambling conversations, and still insisted that his household routines be maintained as much as possible. Eva Braun continued to serve as hostess when appropriate, organizing entertainments and trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, even as the war news became increasingly troubling. Hitler's secretaries, who lived at the Berghof when Hitler was in residence, later described a surreal atmosphere in which they would spend mornings taking dictation about military orders that would send thousands of men to their deaths, then spend afternoons having tea on the terrace and admiring the mountain views as if they were on a pleasant vacation. This disconnect between the beautiful, peaceful setting and the horrific realities of the war being directed from that location was one of the most disturbing aspects of the Berghof's role in history. The security around the Berghof became increasingly elaborate as the war progressed, and the possibility of assassination attempts or commando raids became more real. The SS guards were supplemented with anti-aircraft batteries positioned around the mountain to defend against air attacks. Additional bunkers were constructed with even thicker concrete walls and deeper excavations into the mountain. The screening of visitors became more thorough, with multiple checkpoints and identification procedures required to get anywhere near Hitler's residence. A system of observation posts was established on surrounding mountain peaks to watch for approaching aircraft or any other potential threats. Despite all these security measures, Hitler himself often seemed surprisingly casual about his personal safety when he was at the Berghof, taking walks in the grounds with minimal security present and standing at his famous picture window, where a sniper with a rifle in good position might have had a clear shot. This apparent fearlessness may have been genuine courage, or it may have been the recklessness that came from Hitler's growing sense that he was protected by fate or destiny to complete his mission. As the war turned against Germany, starting with the disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union and the defeat at Stalingrad in 1943, Hitler's visits to the Berghof became less frequent. He spent more time at his military headquarters in East Prussia, called the Wolf's Lair, where he could be closer to the Eastern Front that was now the focus of Germany's desperate struggle. The Berghof began to feel like a relic of better times, a reminder of the days when Hitler's ambitions seemed achievable and Germany's future seemed bright. When Hitler did return to the Berghof, he was a changed man, older, more tired, and showing the strain of directing a war that was increasingly unwinnable. His health was deteriorating, possibly due to the various medications and drugs his personal physician was administering, and his famous rages became more frequent and more intense. The staff at the Berghof noticed these changes and worried about the future, though none dared speak openly about their concerns. The final visit Hitler made to the Berghof came in July 1944, just weeks after the Allied invasion of Normandy had opened a second front in the west and made Germany's strategic situation nearly hopeless. Hitler arrived at his beloved mountain retreat knowing that the end was approaching, though he refused to admit defeat or consider surrender. He spent a few weeks at the Berghof, going through the motions of his old routines but without the enthusiasm and energy of earlier years. He walked in the gardens, took tea on the terrace, and sat before his famous window. But now the beautiful mountain views seemed to mock him, representing a peace and permanence that his crumbling empire could no longer claim. In mid-July, Hitler left the Berghof for the last time, traveling back to his eastern headquarters to deal with the aftermath of the July 20th assassination attempt in which a group of German officers tried to kill him with a bomb. He would never return to his mountain kingdom. The Berghof, which had been the setting for so many important moments in Hitler's rise to power and the history of Nazi Germany, would continue to exist for less than a year before meeting its own violent end.